Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We are glad to have you here. Milu and I have another topic for you that we found personal interest in our day jobs. So a little bit of passion, a little bit of honestly trying to work out a situation I have at work that isn't going to be talking about my day job whatsoever, but is adjacent to some of the stuff that I do that it's like, that's an interesting topic that I would like to explore more on. So that's the joy of having a podcast sometimes, is being able to work out topics of interest.
Being able to workshop on data security. Today, we're talking about really who cares about data security within an organization. Obviously, for the most part, we hope that all employees care about security across the organization, but for the most part, there generally are teams that are responsible for data security and making sure that they're complying with their requirements and making sure that systems stay secure.
Yeah. So the idea really came about of, who needs to hear the story of data governance, data security posture management, those types of buzzwords, to give you some buzzwords to start with, and we'll move on from those. Who's in the organization responsible for those things? Who are the people that will care about that? That should be responsible for it, that should be potentially looking at products to help them or creating governance around that. So we want to kind of explore that topic a little bit. It's going to be a lot of us just kind of thinking out loud, I think, but hopefully that'll work for everybody. So I kind of would like to start, Milu, with talking about some of the constituencies, some of the people, some of the organizational parts of a company that does care. So that, we talk a lot about CISOs, so let's start there. The InfoSec team, if you will. What role do they play in data security, and why do they generally care about the security of data?
Yeah, so they're usually responsible with the product security, with actual customer data security. Sometimes IT flows into the information security team as well, of making sure that the internal systems are secure. But for the most part, they're focusing really on the infrastructure, the security architecture, and making sure that customer data remains confidential, protected, and does not get exposed in any way. So they're really making sure that they're taking the security controls that might be coming out of compliance requirements and are actually implementing them by making sure that their systems are meeting the requirements, that they can actually comply with their audit recs and actually make sure that the system itself is secure.
Yeah. And that's, I think, why it just naturally pops up as the default, is because the CISO and their team is responsible for security of the organization, which, keeping data secured is part of the job. And I think when it comes to the execution of data security, it's very heavily led by them. Who should have access to this particular document because it has this type of data in it. And of course, the level of sensitivity of the data is super important in that, and figuring out who should have access to it. So categorizing data and understanding what's going on there, that's pretty heavily in the realm of the CISO in most organizations, I think, as they try to figure out who should have access and who shouldn't have access to a particular piece of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And then usually the team that's working alongside them is then compliance, or GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, which very often would have a chief compliance officer or head of compliance. And they care more about the certifications and the security controls, the what maybe behind what does the organization need to do to implement those technical and administrative measures to making sure that the systems are secure. So they're really working with regulators as well as audit and certification bodies to making sure they're super clear on what the rules and requirements are to secure the systems, but they're potentially less involved in the actual technical configurations of those security controls. So they also work very closely with legal to make sure that, in the case of a data breach, that there's incident response procedures in place and that they know exactly how they were supposed to respond. But I would say the GRC function is really understanding the rules and the requirements that the organization needs to follow. And then very often the information security team members are the ones that are actually implementing the controls.
Yeah. So kind of your classic, I'm going to set policy on the GRC team. and the CISO, the InfoSec team is going to go and execute that. Usually not super prescriptive of go do X, Y, Z, but go protect this data and only allow finance people to see this because it's got, internal financial stuff. Setting those policies and then leaving it to technical experts in the InfoSec team to then go and execute on those. The last kind of group is kind of the CISOs the CIOs organization. Your traditional IT team. So the people that are managing the servers, managing the network, managing databases, operating systems, applications. Obviously, they play a role in there because they're the ones generating the data, or their systems are the ones generating their data. They tend to be the whole point of having an application, having all of this networking, having all of this infrastructure is to provide access from users to the data. And so they're responsible for all that plumbing, if you will, to get that connected. And so they obviously play a role in helping to execute on that as well. I have definitely seen orgs where the compliance team is saying we need to do these things, and the CISO InfoSec team saying, hey, this is how we're going to do it. And then the IT team being the ones to go out and do it. They're setting the policies, they're creating the groups within whatever identity provider is being used, and then applying those permissions to folders and files and whatnot. So obviously having an intricate role there in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and ideally these teams work together, right, to ultimately secure the systems. Ideally, information security is working with compliance, is working with IT, and those three teams are working in lockstep with the rest of the organization to ensure that those controls are being properly implemented and vetted throughout the organization.
And that's kind of in a healthy state. In a healthy state, they're working together. Obviously, there are organizations that are, I don't know if I go as far as to say dysfunctional, but they're not super functional at that level of, working together across teams. And that's a bit of where it kind of comes into is that this is everybody's responsibility. Like all three of these groups have a level of responsibility. Technically, everybody does. If I'm a individual contributor in a group and I happen to get access to data, I should be reporting that. I should be notifying somebody that, hey, I've got access to HR's entire list of all the employees and their salaries. That's probably not right. And somebody else might have accidentally gotten that same level of access. And so everybody is responsible. But when everybody's responsible, sometimes an organization that doesn't have strong top-down leadership or really strong ability to kind of take control of a situation, you sometimes end up with everybody, it's the Spider-Man pointing meme where they're all pointing at each other saying, no, it's your responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. Or in a more generous interpretation of that, it's, is it my responsibility? Is it my responsibility? Like nobody actually takes it. They just question whether it's theirs or not. So that is, to me, kind of the crux of the question then becomes, with those different constituencies all having a responsibility, who should be taking charge? Like, to me, a little bit, it feels like the GRC team, the compliance team needs to define, hey, as we manage data, we need to make sure we manage it appropriately because there are these areas where we're going to get dinged pretty seriously if we don't manage it properly. And therefore, technical teams, I need you to go out and manage data security in this way and to define that and then, essentially govern it to make sure that it's being implemented properly. Is that feel like a fair assessment to you, Milo, or have you seen it differently?
I think I generally see the CISO as the one taking the lead as much as I think compliance is usually setting the baseline standard. Ideally, right, security is going beyond that and actually pushing forward the company's objectives in that regard. So I would say generally, I say the information security team is probably taking the lead on the data security side. Obviously, should be working very closely with IT and compliance to making sure that they're all on the same page. But I would generally say that I think I see the InfoSec team leading the charge of making sure that they're the one taking the ownership and the leadership position within the organization, I think is generally kind of what I've seen.
Okay. So it's kind of the concept of this, the CISO is in the driver's seat, if you will, for managing security. And therefore they need to find out what the proper security is from the GRC team. They need to work with the CIO's team to make sure that it's put together in the proper way. And then they become, for lack of a better term, kind of the auditors to make sure that things did get, the two did get married up appropriately in the real world to be able to say, yeah, we've properly secured our our data in that regard. I think the other aspect of it I like to look at is kind of who cares when. So, we oftentimes talk about data having a life cycle and it going through multiple iterations. It gets created, it gets stored, it gets used, maybe it gets archived for some amount of time, and then it needs to be removed in some way, form, or another. And that, of course, that life cycle, particularly that back end of it, is sometimes heavily determined by regulations. But other steps of the process do as well. So on the creation of data is probably an important step, because where does that data get created at? Where does it land? There's a concept of in-flight data and at-rest data. Where does that at-rest data go? I guess from your perspective, what do you see organizations that are considering that? Like, how do they even think about that? Or is it just like, well, the application creates it and puts it where it puts it, and what do I have to care about that?
Wait, what do you mean? What do they care about?
So, like, again, thinking about who's responsible and what they care about in a situation. So in a situation of when data is being created, it has to be stored. So I create a list of, I don't know, social security numbers that I have to report to the government for some reason, to the US government. And I have to dump those out somewhere. And then I have to take that file and I have to save it someplace. Should I save it on my laptop in my downloads folder? Should I save it in my OneDrive? Should I save it in Dropbox? Should I save it on a file server? Like, where do I put that at rest data? And who generally needs to be in the mix of that decision, I guess? Who's going to care at that point where that's stored?
I think a lot of the initial questions of where data is stored within an organization are usually also, I think another stakeholder we haven't mentioned is probably the chief technology officer. So I think the CTO is probably working alongside the CISO and the CIO to making sure that data is being stored within places, right, not on your local machine, and ideally within, especially if it has such sensitive information, within a lockdown, secure file share system that has limited access. So I think there's something to be said around making sure that the infrastructure engineering teams are involved as well, of making sure that the data storage question at least has been addressed ahead of time, right? So that you don't have employees that are storing information all over the place and then you're trying to figure it out later. So I think enabling those teams to making sure that they're coming up with sound foundations of where to store things securely and what that looks like for the organization, making sure there's sufficient access for the information when it's needed, I think is probably the first step for that. And then from there, I think it's making sure that you're thinking through, okay, if that information is in one place, how do we get it to the government system, right? Or how are we sharing that information?
Yeah. And that then kind of leads to me, what is a super adjacent question, which is reducing sensitive data in the environment. If you're living in the real world, I guess, you're living under the mantra of it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we get breached. At some point, somebody's going to get in our environment. If you don't think anybody's in your environment, you just haven't found them yet. Those types of mantras. So then it becomes a question of, if we have sensitive data in our environment, what organization doesn't, because at some point at the very least, you've got whatever makes your company special. And that's some sort of sensitive data. And you assume that inevitably you're going to have somebody who shouldn't be in your environment. Now you start talking kind of that zero trust model, where we want to make sure that data is not available easily. Either we're authenticating people to be able to get that data, so you don't want it to be just kind of publicly open to anybody. And that as the data lands at rest and is retained for long term, wherever that retention may be, in your backups, on a file server, on somebody's individual device, somebody again has to care enough to either push the other parts of the organization to implement controls around this, to make sure that data just doesn't land someplace where it shouldn't be, and try to reduce that sensitive data so that should and when somebody breaks into the environment, whether it be an external adversary or be an internal type person, that they won't have access to that level of sensitive data, that it's not just sitting around waiting for somebody to pick it up. So that, I guess, that next question really becomes, who cares about it at that level? Is it kind of that same, we need to make sure we have a policy on it, and the CISO has to drive that so that the CTO, CIO implements it properly? The thing that tend to start running into is that everybody is responsible for it. So somebody else is always assuming someone else is doing it. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to suss out here is kind of who should care at that point.
It's tricky because I think most organizations aren't necessarily in the business of actually like eliminating sensitive information. Like data destruction is just like not really a thing within most organizations. They usually have some type of compelling reason, or they're going to come up with a compelling reason why they should maintain most of their data. I would say in terms of reducing sensitive information, most likely that is probably coming out of GRC for the most part. I do think they're probably the ones that are coming in with data limitation requirements and are trying to make sure that the company isn't exceeding data retention requirements or data processing agreements that they have with their end users. So I do think most likely that's still coming out of a compliance requirement for the most part. So it's most likely being driven by GRC. But I do think the CIO, the IT team are probably also trying to figure out how do they actually comply with that? How do they actually meet those requirements and do something about it?
Yeah, no small task for certain, because users will do what users do. We've often talked about, are people really the weakest link? And if you don't put the proper controls in place, they do tend to do things that you don't expect, which means sometimes data ends up in places you don't expect, which I think kind of leads to the next kind of point in the data lifecycle, which is kind of reporting on compromised data. So more and more we have regulations that say once you say the word breach, a clock starts and you have to at some point report what data got exposed. Hey, we had a breach. Okay, you got 2 days, and I want in my hand a list of all of the types of data that person potentially could have touched. It doesn't, as I understand, it doesn't necessarily have to be they actually exfiltrated this kind of data. It's more about what do they have the potential to exfiltrate, because you can't always be sure what they may have taken. So again, I'm starting this with regulations, and obviously they're going to care at some level. And at some level, the CISO, the CIO, their orgs are going to have to generate that information. And I guess I'll definitely put a plug in here that this goes back to you got to know what you have in your environment. Otherwise, you simply can't manage it.
Sure.
So the inventory aspect of it, as we kind of alluded to before, is knowing where the sensitive data is in the first place is super important. But I guess I think you've dealt with some breach situations where you've had to do that reporting. How has that worked for you in the past?
Well, the timeline is usually quick, right? I think for the most part, most regulations, it's like within 72 hours of like identification that you need to have like a pretty good awareness and are letting customers know if something's happened. So the timeline is very short. And then I think for the most part, it's usually trying to figure out what was accessed, how, obviously, especially if you're still potentially, if there's somebody in your system, right? You're trying to just like lock it down to making sure that there are no rogue actors in the system itself anymore. I think the reporting part of it then becomes very much a conversation between compliance and legal and the executive team at that point of how are they positioning this, what information was accessed, how do they want to notify regulators, their customers, end users, all of the involved parties, to making sure that they're coming up with a really clear path to address what happened and also try to reestablish some type of trust with their brand, right? Having a data breach is pretty terrible for your reputation. So
Yeah.
of making sure you're being mindful too of working with marketing and PR of coming up with the right talk track for how you announce this type of information, I think happens all simultaneously at the same time. So I do think the reporting part of it really becomes, at that point, that's definitely on GRC. I would say, the information security and IT teams are most likely involved in the investigation and any of the forensics after the fact. But I really do think that GRC, the compliance function, is really driving the actual reporting and the remediation of the data breach. So really working with regulators and making sure that all of the notification requirements are sufficiently met. So it does really fall on compliance at that point. But again, that's definitely a team sport and it's not a fun situation to be in.
No, definitely something you want to make sure you've got a plan for. It's kind of like a disaster recovery, business continuity type situation. It's best to plan that so that you don't have to figure it out in the heat of the moment. I kind of alluded to this one a little bit with internal threats, but that is a real risk factor that hopefully somebody in the organization is considering. And it kind of falls in with the reduce the sensitive data to some extent. Like the less you have, the less likely you are to lose some of it or for somebody to accidentally get it. But to me, the internal threat is a special use case where it's, you've got sensitive data and you need to make sure to keep it narrow enough that only the right people have access to it. Now, of course, somebody who legitimately should have access, if your chief financial officer becomes a threat actor within your environment and they have access to all of the financial information, you've picked the wrong CFO at that point. But that's usually not the way it happens. It usually happens where you've got somebody on the lower level who has access. Somehow they find out there's this folder out here that's not properly protected, and we have access to it. So it's less about having less sensitive data and more about making sure that the sensitive data is properly controlled. Again, we kind of touched on that with the creation and the data at rest aspect of things. But is there any special nuances when it comes to the internal threat actor that may accidentally get access to data?
I think it really comes down to being mindful of actually implementing the principle of least privilege, right? I think most organizations say that they follow that. And then in reality, right, I think very often, especially in the startup space, most people have access to way too much information. So it's like actually the activity to actually like pull back access and actually pull things away from people. I think especially when you're at that scaling startup phase is really tricky when everyone's been in the mindset of having access to everything.
Yeah.
But really like paring down access and making sure that really only like HR and finance have access to certain information versus compliance has access to something else versus IT and engineering, right? Of actually separating out what systems and data sets individual teams have access to and actually trying to implement the principle of least privilege becomes really important. Obviously, in the case of an internal threat, where you have a rogue employee, it's an unlikely scenario. It is absolutely possible, right? A disgruntled employee could happen anywhere. That is a common issue that organizations deal with. But I do think it's really being mindful of actually making sure that you're thinking through of what systems and data sets individual teams have access to and actually pulling it back to making sure that, it should not be that everybody is de facto like system admin or everybody has access to everything. It really should be you have access to the least amount of information that you need to get your job done.
Yeah, and other teams definitely play into this one. Specifically, I think about like the HR organization. As somebody changes roles, as somebody leaves the organization, making sure that their privileges get dealt with appropriately. The number of times I've complained about somebody disappearing from the organization because the company is afraid to admit that people are leaving. The company is afraid to admit they had to fire somebody. The company is afraid to admit that they had a layoff situation. Like whatever the reasons, they let people go quietly and they try to keep it as hush as possible. And then one day you go to contact that person and you get an email kicked back, or you see them deactivated in Slack or whatever IM tool you're using. And that drives me insane because from a security perspective, if that person reached out to me and I saw their name, whether they still had access to Slack, they had Slack on their phone, their account didn't get disabled, or they emailed me even from their personal address and I didn't look close enough to see whether it was from their personal email or from a work email. And they asked for something that would be perfectly normal for them to ask any other day. And controls like that are not always technical. Sometimes they are more organizational, get involved here. And ideally, what I've seen as the best is that as somebody leaves the organization, there's a button that HR pushes that's essentially just kills everything for that person, transfers, or more importantly, maybe transfers ownership to their manager or somebody further up the food chain so that they can monitor that to see if they were a threat actor for some reason, if there was some malfeasance going on that they got let go of because of. That can be more monitored to be able to say, hey, this person is no longer with the company. What can I do to help you? To inject themselves into those types of processes that balls don't get dropped along the way, I think are good. So it's not just a, let's set a policy. Let's try to put in as much automation as possible. Let's try to involve other parts of the organization that are critical in that workflow, even if they don't really care about the data. Again, everybody should care about the data security, but they may not be directly involved in data security normally. So then there's a third kind of nuance to the making sure data has the proper authorization and control around it, which is the public exposure of data. We've all heard over the years, one of the problems with the cloud is that data leaks out of those buckets in the cloud. And that became apparent that was just a default settings problem that we had early on when those buckets were designed for just storing all the images you need on your website.
Yeah, public access.
Yeah, the public access to data, where you essentially just remove all the walls around it and just say anybody can get access to this. That did turn into people throwing stuff into a publicly accessible bucket and not ever thinking about the security aspect of things. They would throw sensitive data in there and not even think about the fact it was, hey, if nobody has the link, then they'll never be able to find it, which is inherently not true. So things like that. I've seen situations where, hey, this sensitive data was just available on the website. Somebody stumbled across it somehow. And of course, we've got the simple somebody attaches a list of social security numbers into an email address and shoots it off across the open internet, and not realizing that email is not a secure communication mechanism whatsoever, especially if you're sending it externally. Obviously, those types of situations, there's a variety of different scenarios that can be dealt with differently. So like email, you've got the concept of data loss prevention that will sit there and they will actually look at data as it's going across that email server and say, wait a second, that's sensitive data. Let's shut down that email and kick it back to the user and say, hey, you've got sensitive data. You can't be doing this. And kind of the leaky buckets, exposing things through like public links in Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive. Being able to share those things externally with just a URL can potentially expose data like this. Again, probably a lot of the model that we've talked about where GRC sets policy and CISO has to, or InfoSec has to then make sure that we abide by it, and, IT teams potentially having to control the access and the group memberships and stuff. But I guess in your experience, kind of what do we see? Who do we see caring about that situation?
About making sure that it's not exposed or actually implementing the data?
Yes, both. Obviously, it's nuanced and it's a team sport.
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's a team sport, right? But I do think of actually like limiting what teams have access to, I do think comes out of policy and making sure that they're very clear on like what information they have to retain legally versus what is potentially information that they could actually get rid of proactively. And again, I do think that is a challenge that a lot of organizations face where they just retain everything indefinitely. And then I do think also the issue of information being exposed publicly, I think very often happens from like a lack of configuration management and not being mindful of like how things are set up initially. Because very often I think something was set up years ago and then people are using it and they're like, we didn't realize that this is publicly available. Or like, oh, it was because, we had to store logos here so that the logos came on the website and we didn't realize that this turned into a larger security threat because people were putting in more than just the minimal information. So I do think it is a team sport. It does require teams actually working together to figuring out, what do they have, where it's stored, how long are they keeping it. I think, a lot of those types of less glamorous, exciting conversations that data governance really pushes through an organization of being mindful of like, what do you have? Where is it stored? How long are we keeping it? Why do we have it? Who has access to it? I think are all really important parts of that conversation.
Yeah. So you mentioned retaining of data, and that is one of the biggest challenges most organizations have.
I keep way too much.
Yeah. Yeah. And there truly becomes a point where data becomes more of a liability than an asset. And that's true in so many things. I get into some urban planning type stuff where, hey, should we build this new road? Well, yeah, everybody loves a new road, except that's not an asset. It's a liability. It's something you're going to have to pay for over time, more than just the installation cost. And so as we think about that being probably the biggest problem we have is that, the best way to get rid of sensitive data is to just not have it. There's regulations that help to define that. Like with GDPR, if I don't want a company to retain my data and I'm an EU citizen, I can go out there and I can say, I don't want you to retain my data. And they've now have to comply with a law that says you will get dinged pretty heavily if you don't delete that data. Then there's also this tipping point of, hey, this data is no longer valuable. In the US, there's HIPAA regulations that say, if you're underage, then that health records have to be retained for a minimum amount of time. And so that data has to, you have to make sure that you retain that and you can't delete it for a certain amount of time. So it's a complex environment for sure. And I can see where a lot of organizations are like, not even going to deal with that. We'll just try to keep everything as squirreled away as possible. But that's not really good enough anymore. And I really do applaud our regulatory environments trying to push this forward to say it actually does matter that you hold on to it forever. Unfortunately, the economics of storing data continue to keep up with the creation of data, both through really great engineering and really great marketing along the way, that keep driving down the price for each Word doc that you store. I used to be concerned about Word docs when I was managing storage on my computer or Dropbox or OneDrive or wherever I was storing data, because it's like, oh, well, man, that 100 kilobyte file is really taking up a lot of my 10 megs of space. And nowadays I've got a terabyte of space. And if I see a Word doc, I just don't even consider it because it's so small compared to all the images and the videos and stuff like that. And, we're getting to the point where there's not much bigger file types. And so it becomes easy to pack rat that data. And I'm as guilty as everyone else because, again, I don't want to lose something that's important by accidentally deleting it. But at the same time, it is a liability that I have that kind of information around. So I think there's a GRC as an obvious answer in this space about who cares about how long we retain data, but I'm assuming others have a perspective here as well.
Yeah, legal definitely does too, of course. I know they work really closely with GRC for the most part, but generally legal is the one that actually is enforcing the data retention policy, specifically on, implementing the 7-year requirement that most organizations follow, that they have to retain information, limited information, not all information. I think that's where companies fall into a lot of pitfalls where they think it's everything, and that is not the case.
Yeah. So heavy dose of legal, make sure we're truly protected as an organization. Makes a lot of sense there for sure.
But yeah, I think just to sum up, I think for the most part, usually the Chief Information Security Officer sets the data security posture. GRC sets the requirements, and then IT, the CIO, work together to implement those within the organization. I think all 3 teams work very closely with the rest of the organization to actually implement a data governance posture within the organization and actually try their best to secure their systems and limit access and also limit retention.
Yeah, and obviously every organization is different. They don't always have a CISO. They don't always have a compliance officer. But I feel fairly safe using those generalizations because most organizations have somebody identified as that role. I mean, you've been in the role where you were both legal and compliance at the same time. I've seen places where both, security and compliance are the same team at the executive level. So, it's less about your titles and the name of your team and more about the hats that you wear when it comes to these things. But it's an interesting balance. Like truly everybody should care, and theoretically that means the CEO cares and is driving who's spending their time caring, I guess. Everybody cares, but somebody has to take the time to coordinate all the bits and pieces together. So big team sport, just like we've always talked about with security. But I appreciate you kind of thinking through that with me, Lou. It's good to hear kind of your compliance directed mindset on this, knowing that you've seen a lot of all the other parts as well. So very interesting topic for me right now.
Yeah, I hope it was helpful to brainstorm a little bit here while we were chatting.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully it was valuable to all of you listening. Again, we're just trying to touch on a lot of different topics here lately. Got a really cool slate of guests coming up that we're getting started on recording. So hopefully you'll be hearing those pretty soon to get some new perspectives on things. So with that, I think we'll wrap up, and we hope you all have a great day. Thanks for socializing with us. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.